The blizzard of 1883 didn't just bury the Wyoming Territory. It buried deadly secrets. When a hardened mountain man pulled a half-frozen bride from the wreckage of a snowbound carriage, he thought he was merely saving a life. He didn't know he was dragging a ruthless war straight to his doorstep. According to the Territorial Archives of Laramie County, the winter of 1883 was one of the most unforgiving in recorded history. Locals called it the White Death, a sudden, plunging freeze that caught hundreds of travelers unaware. Deep in the jagged teeth of the Wind River Range, far beyond the reach of the law or civilized society, lived a man who had intentionally turned his back on both. His name was Josiah Mercer. Josiah was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he inhabited. Broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, and possessing a gaze as sharp and cold as the ice on a high-altitude lake, he lived entirely off the grid. He survived by running trap lines and hunting elk, coming down to the trading post in Cutbank only twice a year. History paints men like Josiah as simple hermits, but court records from Denver suggest a different past, one involving a stolen ranch, a corrupt railroad syndicate, and a bounty on his head that he had successfully evaded for half a decade. He lived in isolation not out of a love for solitude, but out of a necessity for survival. On the afternoon of November 14th, the sky above Dead Man's Pass turned a bruised, sickly purple. Josiah recognized the signs immediately. The wind stopped howling, and instead began to hum a low, terrifying vibration that preceded a massive atmospheric collapse. He was 6 miles from his cabin, snowshoes strapped to his boots, hauling a freshly dressed deer carcass on a makeshift sled. Then, the storm broke. It didn't snow. The sky simply dropped. Visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet within minutes. The temperature plummeted so fast that Josiah could hear the sap freezing and cracking inside the trunks of the lodgepole pines around him. He knew he had to abandon the sled and push for home, or he would be a frozen monument by morning. He had made it perhaps 2 miles, navigating by the slope of the terrain and the bark of the trees, when he heard it. It wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, metallic snap of a carriage axle braking, followed by the muffled, terrified shriek of horses. Josiah hesitated. In a storm like this, stepping off his path meant almost certain death, but the unwritten code of the frontier tugged at his conscience. Pulling his heavy buffalo hide collar up around his ears, he veered east, marching through waist-deep drifts toward the sound. What he found at the bottom of a steep ravine was a scene of utter devastation. A private luxury carriage, painted in a dark, aristocratic blue completely unsuited for the mountain trails, lay overturned. The horses had already broken their traces and fled in panic. The driver was nowhere to be seen, likely thrown into the ravine and buried by the heavy snowfall. Josiah wrenched the splintered carriage door open. Inside, partially buried under shattered wood and velvet cushions, lay a woman. She was entirely out of place in the brutal Wyoming wilderness. She wore a heavy, dark green traveling dress of fine silk, tailored in a high society fashion that belonged in a Boston parlor, not a frozen ravine. Her skin was as pale as the snow swirling around them, her lips tinged with a dangerous shade of blue. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and erratic. Clutched desperately in her trembling, frostbitten hands was a thick, oilskin satchel. Josiah checked her pulse. It was faint, like the flutter of a dying bird's wing. Hypothermia was already shutting her body down. He knew that if he left her to fetch help, she would be dead in 20 minutes. If he stayed with her, they would both die in 30. There was only one choice. "God forgive me for what I'm about to put you through," Josiah muttered, his voice instantly swallowed by the roaring gale. He pulled her from the wreckage. She was shockingly light, though the heavy, ice-caked layers of her dress added agonizing dead weight. He quickly unfastened his heavy outer bear fur coat, wrapping it securely around her fragile frame, leaving himself in nothing but his wool layers and leather duster. He hoisted her over his broad shoulder, securing her legs with one arm while grabbing the oilskin satchel she refused to let go of with his other hand. The next 4 miles were a testament to human endurance, documented later in the journals Josiah kept. The snow rose to his thighs. Every step was a battle against the crushing weight of the wind, which battered him like physical blows. Ice froze in his thick beard, sealing his lips shut. The cold began to seep through his boots, turning his toes into useless blocks of wood. His lungs burned with every intake of the razor-sharp air. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she was crossing Dead Man's Pass in a private carriage during the worst month of the year. All he knew was the rhythm of survival. Left foot, right foot, breathe, push. He carried her through the storm. For 4 grueling hours, Josiah Mercer became a machine fueled purely by adrenaline and sheer stubborn willpower. He ignored the burning cramps in his thighs, the agonizing sting in his exposed face, and the whispering temptation in his mind to just lie down in the snow and sleep for a few minutes. When the jagged, snow-caked roof of his cabin finally materialized through the blinding whiteout, Josiah was running on fumes. He kicked the heavy oak door open, the wind violently pushing them inside. He slammed the door shut, dropping the iron bar across it, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the storm. They had made it out of the white grave. But as Josiah looked down at the pale, lifeless woman on his floor, he knew the real battle to save her had just begun. Josiah's cabin was a fortress built for isolation, but it held a unique architectural secret. While the main room was rugged and drafty, he had excavated a secondary chamber directly into the hillside behind the massive stone fireplace. This alcove, barely large enough for a bed and a chair, was lined with river stones that absorbed and radiated the intense heat from the hearth. It was essentially an oven, the warmest room for 50 miles in any direction. He carried her past the main living area, kicking aside traps and stacked firewood, and laid her gently on the thick pelt-covered bed in the back room. The temperature here was sweltering compared to the freezing abyss outside, but the woman was shivering violently, her teeth chattering with a frightening ferocity. Josiah knew the brutal mechanics of severe hypothermia. The wet, freezing clothes had to come off immediately, or the moisture would continue to sap her core temperature until her heart simply stopped. With practiced clinical efficiency stripping away any notion of propriety for the sake of survival, he went to work. He cut away the ruined, ice-locked silk of her dress, the frozen petticoats, and the soaked leather of her boots. He worked quickly, keeping his eyes focused purely on the medical necessity of the task. Once she was stripped down to her thin, dry undergarments, he wrapped her tightly in 3 layers of heavy, fire-warmed buffalo robes. He grabbed 6 smooth river stones he kept near the hearth, wrapping them in thick wool cloth, and tucked them into the blankets around her feet, under her arms, and near her core. Finally, he brewed a harsh, bitter tea of willow bark and pine needles, slowly dripping the steaming liquid between her blue lips until she reflexively swallowed. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, burying the cabin up to the roofline. For 3 days, Josiah did not sleep. He sat beside her in the sweltering heat of the warmest room, tending to the fire, changing the heated stones, and forcing broth and water down her throat. In her delirium, she thrashed and cried out, speaking in fragmented, panicked sentences. She pleaded with phantoms, crying out against a man named Adrian. She clung to Josiah's calloused hand, her nails digging into his flesh, begging him not to let the Pinkertons take her. The mention of the Pinkerton Detective Agency sent a cold spike of adrenaline through Josiah's chest. Pinkertons didn't hunt ordinary people. They hunted outlaws, or they hunted for the impossibly wealthy. On the evening of the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Josiah was sitting by the hearth, whittling a piece of cedar, when he heard a soft, raspy intake of breath from the back room. He stepped into the alcove. She was sitting up, clutching the heavy buffalo robes to her chest, her wide, terrified eyes darting around the small, windowless stone room. When her gaze landed on Josiah's massive, bearded silhouette in the doorway, she instinctively pressed herself against the back wall. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice dry and cracked. "Where is my satchel?" "You're in the Wind River Range," Josiah said, keeping his voice low and steady to avoid spooking her further. "Your carriage went off the trail in the pass. Your driver is gone. You've been burning up with a fever for 3 days." He pointed to the small wooden table near the bed. "Your bag is right there. Hasn't been opened." She scrambled forward, her pale fingers desperately grabbing the oilskin satchel, pulling it against her chest as if it were a shield. She looked at him, truly taking in his rugged, imposing appearance. You brought me here? Through the blizzard?" "I couldn't well leave you to freeze, miss," Josiah replied, crossing his arms. "Though I'll admit, bringing a lady of your standing into my home is a risk I don't usually take. I'm Josiah Mercer." She hesitated, her eyes studying his face, searching for deceit. Finding none, her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "Lydia. My name is Lydia Stanton." Josiah nodded slowly. "Well, Lydia Stanton, you're lucky to be breathing. But judging by the way you were screaming in your sleep about Pinkertons and a man named Adrian, I'm guessing the cold wasn't the only thing trying to kill you out there." Lydia's breath hitched. She looked down at her hands, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. The silence in the cabin stretched, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, muffled howl of the wind outside. "Adrian Anderson," she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. He was my fiancé." Josiah's posture stiffened instantly. The whittling knife in his hand stopped moving. "Adrian Anderson? The railroad man? The one who bought up half the politicians in Denver?" Lydia looked up, surprised by his recognition. "You know of him?" "Every man who's been run off his land in the Wyoming Territory knows of Adrian Anderson," Josiah said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous razor-sharp edge. Lydia clutched the satchel tighter. "My father was his lead accountant. 2 weeks ago, my father discovered that Adrian was embezzling from his own investors and framing innocent ranchers for theft to seize their land. When my father threatened to go to the marshals, Adrian had him. He had him killed. Made it look like a robbery." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away with sudden, fierce defiance. "Adrian thought he could silence my family by forcing me to marry him. He thought I was just a naive girl." She unbuckled the oilskin satchel, reaching inside and pulling out a thick, leather-bound ledger. "I stole his private ledger from his safe," Lydia said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Every bribe, every stolen deed, every murder he paid for, it's all in here. I was trying to reach the federal judge in Cheyenne. Adrian's men, the Pinkertons, they were right behind me. They must have sabotaged the carriage." Josiah stared at the ledger. The flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his scarred face. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. 5 years ago, Adrian Anderson had paid a corrupt sheriff to burn Josiah's family ranch to the ground, killing Josiah's older brother in the process. Josiah had spent half a decade hiding in the snow, plotting a revenge he thought he'd never get. And now, the sky had literally dropped the key to Adrian Anderson's destruction, wrapped in silk, right into his arms. "You carried me through the storm," Lydia said softly, watching the intense storm of emotions play across Josiah's face. "Why?" Josiah stepped into the warmest room, pulling a heavy Winchester rifle from its mount on the wall. He checked the action, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the small space. "Because, Miss Stanton," Josiah said, looking her dead in the eye, "the storm outside is breaking, but the one coming for you is just getting started. And Adrian Anderson's men are going to find out the hard way that they aren't the most dangerous things in these mountains." The morning of the 5th day broke with a blinding, crystalline brilliance. The howling wind that had battered the cabin into submission finally died, leaving behind an absolute, ringing silence. The Wind River Range was entombed in 10 feet of fresh, undisturbed powder. To the untrained eye, it was a pristine winter paradise. To Josiah Mercer, it was a tactical nightmare. "They won't come on horseback," Josiah said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. He stood by the hearth, meticulously oiling the lever action of his Winchester. "The drifts are too deep. If they survived the freeze, they'll be on snowshoes, which means they'll be quiet, and they'll be desperate." Lydia Stanton sat at the small wooden table, the heavy buffalo robe draped over her shoulders. The color had returned to her cheeks, though a lingering ghost of trauma shadowed her eyes. She watched Josiah work, her hands resting protectively on the leather ledger. "How many do you think there are?" "Adrian Anderson wouldn't send a single man to retrieve a book that could hang him," Josiah muttered, sliding brass cartridges into the rifle's loading gate. "He'd send a squad, and if they are Pinkertons, they'll be led by someone who knows how to read the high country. Someone like Charlie Siringo." Lydia's breath caught. Even in the high society parlors of Boston, the name Charlie Siringo carried a dark weight. The cowboy detective was a relentless, historically documented operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, known for infiltrating outlaw gangs and tracking fugitives across the most unforgiving terrains on Earth. If Siringo was leading the hunt, they were not dealing with ordinary hired guns. They were dealing with an apex predator. "Stay in the back room," Josiah commanded, grabbing a heavy wool coat and a bandolier. "Keep the iron poker from the fireplace in your hand. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. If I don't walk back through that door—" He paused, his hardened eyes softening for a fraction of a second as he looked at her. "There's a trap door under the bed. It leads to a root cellar, and from there, a narrow tunnel that exits behind the snowbank. Run south. Don't look back." Lydia stood up, the heavy robe slipping slightly from her shoulders. She didn't tremble. The pampered city girl who had boarded a carriage in Denver was dead, frozen in the ravine. The woman standing before Josiah was forged in the fire of his warmest room. "Come back through that door, Josiah. I am not dying in this snow, and neither are you." Josiah gave a single curt nod, unbarred the heavy oak door, and slipped out into the blinding white. The cold was still sharp enough to crack stone. Josiah moved with predatory grace, his snowshoes distributing his weight as he navigated the perimeter of his property. He didn't just know this mountain. He was a part of it. He spent the first hour burying 3 massive iron-jawed bear traps in the narrow choke points between the lodgepole pines, the only logical approaches to the cabin. He found a vantage point behind a massive granite outcropping, brushed the snow from a flat ledge, and waited. 2 hours passed. The sun climbed higher, glaring off the snow and threatening snow blindness. Then, a branch snapped. It was a subtle sound, muffled by the powder. But in the absolute silence of the high country, it sounded like a cannon shot. 4 figures emerged from the eastern ridge. They were wrapped in heavy canvas dusters and wool scarves, moving in a staggered tactical formation. Even from 200 yards away, Josiah recognized the man in the rear. He didn't wear a bowler hat like the city agents. He wore a wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Charlie Siringo. Josiah sighted his Winchester, exhaling a long, slow plume of white breath. He didn't aim for Siringo. He aimed for the man on point. Crack. The rifle shot shattered the silence, echoing off the valley walls in a deafening cascade. The lead Pinkerton jerked backward, an angry red blossom exploding on the shoulder of his canvas coat, and collapsed into the deep drift. Instantly, the remaining 3 men dove for cover behind the thick trunks of the pines. A volley of return fire chewed into the granite outcropping inches from Josiah's head, showering him in stone shrapnel and ice. "Mercer!" Siringo's voice boomed through the trees, carrying a surprisingly calm conversational tone despite the gunfire. "You're outgunned, mountain man. We don't care about the bounty on your head. We just want the girl and the book." Josiah didn't answer. He racked the lever, shifting his position. He watched the tree line intently. One of the agents, a burly man with a shotgun, tried to flank to the left, rushing between 2 pines. A sharp, metallic snap echoed through the woods, followed by an agonizing, blood-curdling scream. The man tumbled face first into the snow, his right leg caught in the serrated jaws of a 50-pound bear trap hidden beneath the powder. 2 down. 2 left. Josiah waited for the 3rd man to make a mistake. But minutes ticked by, and the woods remained eerily silent. Only the muffled groans of the trapped man broke the quiet. Josiah frowned. Siringo was too smart to stay pinned down. A sudden, sickening realization hit Josiah like a physical blow to the stomach. He's not trying to flank me. He's bypassing me entirely. Josiah scrambled down from the granite ledge, abandoning his vantage point, and sprinted back toward the cabin. His lungs burned, his snowshoes kicking up massive clouds of powder. As he cleared the tree line, his worst fear was realized. The heavy oak door of his cabin was wide open, swinging slightly in the gentle winter breeze. Josiah threw himself through the open doorway, dropping to one knee and sweeping the main room with his rifle. The cabin was empty. The fire in the hearth was dying down. "Drop the Winchester, Mercer." The voice came from the back, from the warmest room. Josiah slowly stood, his finger hovering dangerously over the trigger. He walked toward the stone alcove. Standing inside, shielding his body entirely behind Lydia, was Charlie Siringo. The Pinkerton detective held a heavy Colt revolver pressed firmly against Lydia's temple. Lydia was pale, but her jaw was set in a tight line of defiance. The ledger was tucked firmly under Siringo's left arm. "You're a hard man to hunt, Josiah," Siringo said, a thin, grim smile touching his lips. "But you made a mistake. You cared about something other than yourself." "Let her go, Siringo," Josiah said, his voice dangerously low. "You have Anderson's book. Take it and walk out of here. You don't need her blood on your hands." Siringo let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You've been out of the loop up here, mountain man. You think Adrian Anderson sent us?" Siringo shook his head. "Anderson is dead. The railroad syndicate found out he was skimming off the top and hanging innocent ranchers to cover his tracks. They had him strung up from a telegraph pole in Denver 3 days ago." Lydia gasped, her eyes widening in shock. "Adrian is dead?" "Deader than hell, Miss Stanton," Siringo replied. "But that ledger you stole? It implicates the entire syndicate. Bribed judges, bought-off senators, illegal land grabs. The men I work for don't want this book destroyed. They want it so they can blackmail the whole damn territory. They sent me to make sure there were no loose ends." Siringo cocked the hammer of the Colt. The metallic click was deafening in the small stone room. "You're a loose end, miss." Josiah saw the muscles in Siringo's arm tense. He had half a second to act, but Siringo was completely covered. But Josiah wasn't the only one who had survived the wilderness. Lydia, remembering the blistering heat of the river stones Josiah had used to save her life, didn't freeze in panic. In a flash of desperate, brilliant violence, she reached back with her free hand, grabbed the heavy, cast-iron fire poker resting against the hearth, and slammed it backward not at Siringo, but into the glowing, red-hot coals of the fire. A cloud of blinding, searing ash and sparks erupted directly into Siringo's face. The detective screamed, instinctively pulling his head back and firing the Colt blindly into the ceiling. The concussive boom shook dust from the rafters. That was all the opening Josiah needed. He didn't fire the rifle. The risk of hitting Lydia in the confined space was too high. Instead, Josiah lunged forward, closing the distance in a single, massive stride. He drove the heavy brass buttstock of the Winchester directly into Siringo's chest, shattering ribs and launching the detective backward. Siringo hit the stone wall of the alcove with a sickening crunch, sliding to the floor, unconscious before he even landed. The ledger dropped from his grip. Lydia stumbled forward, gasping for air, her hands shaking violently. Josiah dropped the rifle and caught her, wrapping his arms around her as she finally let out a choked sob. "It's over," Josiah whispered, his massive hand gently cradling the back of her head. "It's over. He's done." They bound Siringo with heavy hemp rope, tossing him and his surviving wounded deputies out in the snow to freeze or find their own way off the mountain. Josiah packed up his cabin. He knew he could never return to his life of isolation. The world had found him, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't want to hide from it. The journey to Laramie took a grueling week. They navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked passes, sharing the warmth of the buffalo robes at night, their bond solidifying in the crucible of survival. Lydia Stanton, the wealthy Boston socialite, learned to shoot, to track, and to endure. Josiah Mercer, the hardened fugitive, remembered how to trust, how to laugh, and how to love. When they finally rode into Laramie, they didn't go to the local sheriff. They went straight to the federal courthouse, walking directly into the chambers of United States District Judge Moses Hallett. Lydia slammed the leather ledger onto the judge's mahogany desk. The subsequent federal investigation tore through the territorial government like a wildfire. Warrants were issued, corrupt politicians were unseated, and the syndicate was utterly dismantled. As part of her testimony, Lydia secured a full, unconditional pardon for Josiah Mercer, clearing his name of the false charges Adrian Anderson had manufactured half a decade prior. 6 months later, the snow melted off the Wind River Range, revealing a landscape reborn in vibrant greens and wildflowers. Josiah stood on the porch of a newly built ranch house in the valley below his old mountain pass. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was building. The wooden screen door creaked open, and Lydia stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She wore a simple cotton dress, her face tanned and radiant. The ghosts of the winter storm entirely vanished from her eyes. She handed him a mug and leaned against his broad chest, looking out over the sprawling acres of land that finally belonged to them. He had carried her through the storm, saving her life. But as Josiah wrapped his arm around his wife, looking at the empire of peace they had built together, he knew the absolute truth of it. She had saved his. If Josiah and Lydia's harrowing tale of blizzard survival, deadly Pinkerton betrayals, and wild frontier justice kept you entirely on the edge of your seat, don't let the story end here. Smash that like button. Share this gripping Wyoming romance with your fellow history buffs,